But I did want to introduce the panel because this is, well, first of all, how many of you guys are gamers out there? Exactly. And how many of you people realize where all of that came from? Don't answer that. It's right up here. To my immediate left is Al Alcorn, one of Atari's original employees, inventor of Pong. Steve Russell to his left is a PDP-1 programmer extraordinaire and came up with this concept called Space War back in the early 1960s. And then Don Woods, on the far left, is the Woods half of the Crother and Woods adventure game, which was the very first text adventure, the one that we're actually memorializing on our shirt with Get Lamp. We'll give you a shirt in a minute. Okay, maybe an hour.
I have an adventure map on my shirt, so it's okay.
Excellent. And we've actually got an adventure map at one of our exhibits up here, which you're going to want to see on your way through. But with that said, I know that Steve has a question that he likes to ask about gaming all the time, and I wanted him to kick this off with that. I'm just going to get out of the way and let these guys talk unless it looks like it's slowing down.
What was the question?
Well, I've heard you ask a few times whether or not you think this gaming thing is going to catch on.
Oh, well, Al and I, whenever we see each other, frequently ask, do you think there's any future to this game business? I built games long before they were profitable.
Right.
And with a $120,000 computer, it's kind of hard to fit into an arcade or anywhere else. It just has to be something you scrounge time on.
Right. Yeah, over time we finally managed to make the games cheap enough that you could play them on personal computers. Well, of course, once personal computers began to exist, it helped. But yeah, as far as games being profitable, they're certainly a profitable industry. I personally have never made a living out of making games. I much prefer playing them and designing them, but I've never managed to actually sell them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because Steve Russell really, when people say, what's the first video game, I would argue that the Space War was, and that's what caused Atari to be what it is. In a way, but you didn't get any money for it, so there, we took the money.
I was one of the first people to lose money on a two-person video game.
There you go. But Nolan.
Okay.
So,
well, I can hear lots of echo, so I don't understand what your problem is.
But Nolan went to University of Utah. They had a PDP-1. He saw Space War. At the same time, he worked in an arcade in Seattle in the summer, managing the coin-op pinball machines. And he knew about the business side of it, and he said, boy, if I could put a coin slot on Space War, that'd be great, it would sell. But for whatever, how much did a PDP-1 cost back then?
$120,000 in 1961.
So that's well over $1 million today, and the economics didn't work, even at a quarter. So Nolan thought about it, and he finally figured out a way. He was going to do it so hard, he was so convinced to do it, that the first idea was to take a Supernova mini computer that had come down in price to a couple $1,000s and use that, and then make an arcade and have it run about 10 or 15 machines at once. And the economics might have worked, except the Nova was so slow it really didn't do video or graphics. And he kept building interface circuits, and what was left over for the computer to do was so minor, he could do it with some gates and flip-flops and a logic table. And boom, Computer Space was born, which is a weak raster version of Space War. And it didn't do that. It did okay. They sold maybe 1,000 machines, but then Nolan, other story, quit Nutting Associates and started Syzygy Company, which became Atari, hires me, and the rest is history.
Yeah, but you didn't even use a computer.
What's that?
You didn't even use a computer.
No, God no. I mean, back in 1972, the only microprocessor was the 4004. And that was so slow you could like watch it work. And video was a very, very high rate. you know, it's basically you're shipping pixels out at 3 megahertz rate. So just in those days, there just wasn't any way you could get a computer that would do that at that kind of effectiveness. And so the whole trick with Pong and the early in computer space was a clever logic trick to be able to make the ball move in all these different positions and have no memory at all, just have a couple of counters going.
I guess one of the things I'd like to talk about is first. It turns out Space War was hardly the first of anything. There was noughts and crosses on EDSAC in 1952 or 3, which was tic-tac-toe game. It was displayed on a CRT, but the CRT wasn't intended as a display. It was intended as a diagnostic tool for their memory. But it turned out you could write on it, and so it did zeros and X's and played tic-tac-toe. Then there was Tennis for Two, which was a demonstration at Brookhaven Laboratories on Long Island in the middle 50s. And it had a tennis ball that bounced back and forth and a knob for each player. And you twisted the knob to bat the ball back and forth. Neither of these were particularly memorable or long-lasting, but they were first.
Right.
And they involved a computer. And video game gives me a little problem because video game wasn't coined until 10 years after Space War came out.
Right.
And Space War doesn't know anything about the conventional electronic form of video. It's all very different.
XY, right? Yeah.
And so it just requires an awful lot of fine print to try to make Space War first of anything.
What was the display for the original Space War? I found one.
Downstairs.
It's downstairs.
What nature of display? I ran across one that ran on a vector display.
Well, DEC produced a very primitive display called the Type 30 originally, which was very straightforward. You put X in the accumulator, Y in the I/O register, you give a display instruction. 50 microseconds later, you get a spot.
Right, it's vector graphics.
So
No
it was
vector, no vector.
No.
You just get a spot.
Well, but you were killing it. You're giving it XY coordinates. Put a
Yeah,
spot here,
yeah.
put a spot there, and you
But-
can only do so many spots, right? In certain time.
Yeah, 50 microseconds later, you could give another display instruction. So you get one spot at the cost of several instructions because you have to prepare it, and then you can do it again. And so you're very limited in the number of spots you can display, and that's one of the big advantages of space, is it's mostly black. So anyway, Space War isn't the first, but it left a lasting memory.
Right.
Because almost everybody who worked on early arcade games had seen Space War and remembered it and wanted to do something better with the hardware they had at hand.
Indeed, and in fact, in this museum downstairs, outside of the main exhibit, is two prototype arcade machines, coin-op. I think it was Bill Pitts or Potts did it.
Bill Pitts.
And that was a closer version. It used I believe, a HP or Tektronix vector display, and he had a mini computer in the box, and he had running it at Stanford Student Union, Treasurer Student Union. Well, that was one of our first locations for Pong. So it was kind of funny because I'd see him over there with the teletype, reworking on this thing, and I was just scooping quarters out of this dumb old Pong machine. I would argue that the only place you could really get a lot of success for that kind of a Space War game was at a university where people kind of got the hang of physics and whatnot. And Pong was for two people that could participate in athletics while maintaining a firm grip on a can of beer. And so, you know, we were just, you know, scooping money out and saying, good luck, I'll see you later. Very interesting confluence.
Well, I was very amused. One of the demonstrations of the PDP-1, which, by the way, we'll be doing later on this afternoon, someone asked, how did it feel when it worked? As though there was some great moment when it suddenly worked. And I had to say that it was basically one step in the progression, because being a program, when you first tried to use it, something horrible happened, something unintended happened for sure.
Right.
And so you go through this debugging, getting it to the point where it works, where you only have one thing on the list, which is it crashes on startup.
Yeah.
And when it finally something happens, then all of a sudden you got a whole pile of bugs on the list.
Yes.
This is wrong, that's wrong, this doesn't work.
Not getting too technical, but one of the exciting things that could happen with a vector display, if it didn't have hardware protection, you could burn a hole in the display. Did the machine have hardware protection to keep you from burning a hole in it?
It had just barely enough. Sometimes not quite enough.
Because if you kept pointing the beam at the same spot at full brightness, I've actually seen something like that happen at Ampex when I worked there, and they actually burned a hole through the glass. Yeah, so you got to be careful.
The PDP-1 kind of cheated, because the group that founded DEC had actually been working on computers of one form or another for 8 years, because they started on Whirlwind and went on to do other things. And Whirlwind had that kind of display, and so
Really?
what DEC had was essentially the same version of the dumb Whirlwind display. Not the fancy air defense display,
Okay.
but a dumb display that they had put on early on to convince people that it could do analog stuff.
So one question that I had, you guys were talking about monetizing these games, and it was pretty easy, pretty obvious to get quarters stuffed into a box to make some money from this stuff, but there's no one going to do that with a text adventure. But they made a ton of money on text adventures, including the one that you wrote, Don.
Well, some people may have. I mean, I settled for fame and not fortune. But yeah, the whole genre certainly went off in several directions, and many companies, Infocom notably, but there are others, certainly made their mark and made a fair amount of money while they lasted. And the genre is still doing okay today, although it's sort of a niche.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing, I don't know how many people out here played adventure back in the day, but I personally made a point of getting through the entire game with a perfect score. I had to. It was a mission. And it was insidious.
There were a few things in there that were probably harder than they ought to have been, but
What made you go there?
mostly it was just ideas that came spur of the moment, sometimes from me, sometimes from friends and other onlookers. And they may have not been filtered as aggressively as they should have. Some of the things that went into the original adventure were pretty hard to figure out. I tried to add better clues in version 2 when I got around to that one. But yeah, I was still sort of novice at game design, and so yeah, it was a rough-edged product, but still, the overall genre seems to have attracted a lot of attention, and people like to
Well, it was
solve the
memorable.
puzzles. Yeah, it was different. It was
And people still talk about amazing, twisty little passages.
Oh yeah, there are a number of lines that came out of that game that, amazing twist
I
little
had a
passages.
great deal of fun when I first met Adventure, and it was still getting built out, so it was really good exploring, and I'm sort of surprised that the genre hasn't stayed on.
I think these days people sort of want more images with their story.
Yeah.
We've gotten used to the big budget films, and we want our games to at least try to capture some of that. And some of the games that are coming out, even the ones that are story based, certainly do use the graphics effectively, as the hardware is caught up to the level of the storytelling a bit.
So there's two folks up here that pretty much were one-time game authors, and then somebody who seems to have done it for a bit longer. I for one, don't understand how you drop out of it, but tell about how you changed directions or why it was just sort of an aside or not.
Well, for me, I was never a game guy. I mean, to me, I'm an engineer, and solving a very interesting, difficult technical problem, which was how to make a raster scan video game, a video game with raster, because video, which we knew very well, was an analog medium. We all worked at Ampex. We knew video, and it was analog. And so the challenge was to make an all-digital circuit that generated analog video. That's what we did, and I was very proud of that. And then as Atari progressed and made other games, in coin-op arcade, I got bored. And Nolan kept bugging me to do a home version of Pong. I knew it had to be on a custom chip. I'd never done that before. I didn't think I could do it. And to shut Nolan up, I just said, okay, I'm going to go off and do it. Gave coin-op over to Steve Bristow, and I went off with Harold Lee and Bob Brown, and goddamn, the chip worked. I mean, I'll tell you, the day the chip came in, it worked. It honestly felt like a dog chasing a car. What happens when the dog catches the car? We had no plans. We had nothing. And we saw, we better sell it through a big consumer. There was no consumer electronics in Silicon Valley. So somebody said, oh, well, Sears, they're a big company. Yeah, they got that big building in Chicago. So we cold called Sears in Chicago. It turned out that Sears was selling the Magnavox Odyssey game, which in fact was an analog video game, but okay. And it didn't do too well, but they managed to patch us through to the buyer in the sporting good department that was selling that product, Tom Quinn. And because we said, well, we're with Atari, we've actually invented the game, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, sounds interesting. Tom said, next time I'm in California, I'll stop in and see you guys. 3 days later, he was at our doorstep at 8 o'clock in the morning in Los Gatos. None of us were. We were pretty casual. So he was a little put off by that. God, he was wearing a suit and tie and everything. And so he was kind of disbelieving, but we had it working. And that's how we got, Sears was the first retailer of our Pong thing. But my point, the question was, what did I do afterwards? I was off to engineering challenges. So after that, I started a company with Nolan and the guys called Kuma. That was a video game distribution. You had a set of a cartridge with ROM. We had static RAM, battery backed up, and you could download in the kiosk games. That didn't work. I worked as a stint at Apple Computer as an Apple Fellow and got to work on what became MPEG and the idea of putting video into the computer, video and audio, which at the time, the geniuses at Apple, Scully and Gassé, said was a stupid idea. So great, they let us go off and do it, and now the internet is clogged with videos of kittens and puppies. So to me, I'm an engineer. The answer to the question is, I'm probably the worst game designer ever. But from an engineering standpoint, I like the challenge of doing different things.
It's funny, Steve was kind of working on almost a dare or a challenge as well, right?
Well, mostly what I learned about game design later on was that some things are boring and not worth pursuing. And of maybe 5 games that I've worked on more or less seriously, I think I killed 3 of them.
Stillborn. Yeah.
Yep. I've worked on various games. None of them ever really went commercial. We had one that was a play-by-email, multiplayer diplomacy, galactic warfare. development, all sorts of facets to it. And we had a number of games, about 20 odd, that we played with playtest set of players. And had one company that was trying to monetize it for a while and just couldn't make a go of it. So like I said, I've never been successful as somebody who actually produces games and sells games. I know a number of people who have been, and I've got playtest credits on a bunch of their games, but never actually got one myself other than Adventure, which is sort of, as I went out there free and therefore became famous. Fair enough, yes. That was one of the reasons Brad hired me, I believe. So, yeah, I mean, it certainly looks good on the resume, even if it doesn't particularly apply to a lot of the things I've been doing for jobs.
Well, I mean, the good news is most of the programming companies you go to, everyone's got a variable named XYZZY or Plo or Plover or something like that anyway, so at least you're familiar with most of the code.
Yes. But yeah, the challenges of Adventure were different. We didn't have the issues of the video card. I hadn't actually played anything that would qualify as a video game up to that point, unless you count some of the versions of Conway's Game of Life, which I'd seen some that used a video display, sometimes just an oscilloscope being used as a display. But even that one, I had a version of it, and it produced its output on successive pages of paper, which is pretty slow. If you guys are familiar with Conway's Game of Life, it's not the best way to view a changing field of bits, but it was a way to do it, and you could solve problems and analyze positions in the game that way. But I was just sort of used to doing everything in text, even things that were trying to produce images. I would figure out ways to make them happen in text. And after a while, I came across Crowther's version of Adventure, and it had a different way of producing images, namely, the way storytellers have done it for centuries. And I said, well, that's pretty cool, and it's, there's a game element to it because of the exploration. He had one or two puzzle-based treasures, like the gold getting up the steps and trying to figure out how to get past the snake. There were just a couple of things like that in his version, but I saw the promise and said, what else could you do with this? And how can you do it without making the game too complicated to write? Can I come up with a way to characterize the different aspects of the puzzles and the exploration, the rules for moving around within the cave, the rules for picking things up, and what you can bring where and what you manipulate where, and try to encode all of that in a consistent way so that I could come up with a variety of interesting puzzles without having to write a whole bunch of special case code for each of them. And there was a little bit of special case code, but not as much as I think was in Crowther's version, and it does a heck of a lot more. So it made the game big enough and varied enough, I think, to become interesting. And I think that's why it picked up more of a following than Crowther's had. Because Crowther's was out there on the internet. That's how I found it in the first place. It was over at the Stanford Med Center computer, and one of my fellow grad students came across it there. And I found it, and they thought it was interesting, and it's authored by somebody named Crowther somewhere. So sent email to Crowther at X for all values of X that existed at the time, which were a few hundred different sites, and Crowther was at Xerox, and got the message and replied. The rest is history.
One, I think, to me, interesting point about the very early video games was the Magnavox patent. Ralph Baer created this game called Odyssey and patented it in 69, 70, and licensed it to Magnavox to build. So when we come out with Pong, we get slapped with Home Pong with this lawsuit from Magnavox over this patent. And it seemed to me that the patent was invalid on many counts, and so that affected video games throughout the next couple of decades. The reason they had very, very smart patent attorneys, because we were fighting them, and it was a week before the CES show in 1975, I think it was, and Nolan settled the lawsuit with Magnavox for a paid-up license for like $400,000, paid up. Everybody else had to pay a royalty as a percentage. And we asked our attorney said, don't do that, we can win this case, we can beat them. I go, really, how much would it cost? And now when the attorney tells me it's cost, that number is guaranteed to be no less than, right? They said, oh, about $1.2 million. So he said, we're settling. And so we settled the lawsuit, and all these other competing companies then said, hey, God, why didn't you fight them? I go, well, where were you? You know, I mean, come on, you didn't chip in. And now we said, that's a great patent. Build that wall higher, charge those bastards a lot of money, and don't charge us anything. So his early game, I mean, it was ridiculous. People were playing Space War. Every PDP-1 in the world, people were playing Space War.
Some of them didn't have displays.
Okay, everyone went to display, and the management was trying to get them off of that to stop, and this was well before the patent was filed. And the patent read like a spot on a cathode ray tube, like, oh, Christ. Anyway, wonderful patent, wonderful.
Yes, that was actually the most I made off Space War.
Oh.
Was dinner by the patent attorneys who were fighting Atari
There you
versus
go.
Magnavox.
Oh, good. Made some expert witnesses some money along with the attorneys. Okay.
So what do you guys think about the current state of the video game industry? I know I read that Don got sucked into massively multiplayer games at some point, and probably still is if he's anything like me. But that was something that you probably couldn't anticipate back when Pong and Space War were starting out. And, you know, I think everyone here is probably familiar with Pokemon Go. If they haven't hit a Pokemon Go player with their car, they're in the minority. So what do you guys think about where we're at now from the, quote, humble beginnings?
Well, I like the sort of whimsical war games. Some of them have entertaining graphics, and they have some interesting strategy things for you to learn. And one of the things is they now have fairly rich strategy, and that turns out to be one of the crucial things to making a game last is, does it teach you anything, and what is it that it teaches you? Space War was explicitly designed to teach people how to fly spaceships, and to make it, incidentally, to keep their motivation up to make it a game. Some of the modern war games available on your cell phone have fairly rich strategy, and the graphics are entertaining. And I like playing some of those. And the ones that don't have decent graphics just aren't worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree that games in general should teach some useful skill, whether or not you realize it at the time. I know there are people that I've played in, as you say, the massively multiplayer online games, have said that they found that they were able to, that it actually improved their decision making in real life. You know, if they were faced with a sudden decision of, which of two choices or multiple choices to make, they could make those choices quicker and with more confidence because they had been forced to make similar decisions in real time during these massively multiplayer games in raid situations and other time pressure situations. That said, I tend to prefer the games where you have time to stop and think about your moves, where what you're learning is strategy and building complex positions and manipulating systems that migrate from one state to another. You're trying to set up combination plays and coming up with situations like that. I find that interesting in board games. I find it interesting in video games as well. So I played, for example, the Heroes of Might and Magic series was one where you could take your time to figure out what you wanted to do, and then things got set in motion, and you had to deal with the aftermath.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the other side. I'm more capitalistic and pragmatic. Again, Pong was designed so you could participate in athletics while maintaining a firm grip on a can of beer. And it was very simple-minded. In fact, it was so simple-minded that Nolan was convinced it wasn't going to be any good. So it was but he didn't tell me that. He told me he had a contract from General Electric for a consumer product, and oh shit, so I'm sweating trying to make this thing as cheap as possible, and I was failing at that. It had like 70 chips in it. There was no way it was going to be a home game. And, but I kept making it, adding little features like the speed up and the bouncing angles and stuff to make it more fun to play. And at the end, we said, hey, it's not that bad, and put it in the box and put it out there, and the rest is history. So that's sort of my general philosophy, but I will say that I'm glad I'm not in the business today, because back when we were doing it, one person did it.
Have you seen the size of the credits on a modern game?
Yeah, it's safer doing a movie. The odds of making money, you're better off making a movie than you are making a video game. It's really, really a tough field. And I succeeded because I was the only guy in the field at the time, so I could be the smartest guy in the field. But today I would be far from that. I would be the wrong guy to pick.
Incidentally, if you nose around, you'll find the PDP-1, which we're demoing this afternoon, and you can look at it all the time. Galaxy, which was Bill Pitt's arcade version of Space War, and reputedly the first Space War version to accept a coin.
Right. Right.
Which is downstairs in the gallery, in the center of the circular
stairway. By the circular stairway, yeah.
And oh yes, and the Pong prototype is in the computer games gallery.
And we've also got...
There is a cheap imitation of Adventure on one of the displays of its work in the games gallery.
Cool.
And Pac-Man.
It only gets you down underground, and
doesn't go all the way through.
Doesn't have the mazes, that sort of stuff. But mostly it serves as wearing out keyboards, and you do need a little instruction on how to do it.
Steve, into the mic.
Yeah.
Into the mic.
Yeah, you keep missing your mic. Okay. Sorry. Every time you turn your head, I'm afraid.
Sorry. Anyway, it turns out it needs, someone who's never met Adventure needs a bunch of instruction, and we don't do too good a job of that.
That's a shame. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that helped with the original Adventure catching on was that you sit somebody down, it says, welcome to Adventure, would you like instructions? If they can figure out how to type yes and enter, then they're pretty much set.
Well, and I must admit that there is a cheat that I used on Adventure, and that is the conservation of artifacts. As you explore, you discover things you don't understand. And as you start getting lots of things understood, you realize there's some things that need a solution, and you haven't seen what the solution is yet. But there's all these 3 or 4 artifacts that you found that you don't understand. Yep. So you systematically try all of those on the problem at hand.
Pretty much true. I mean, I think in version 2, I probably added a couple of things that really had no particular use. But in general, yeah, everything you found had a purpose somewhere.
Yeah.
Even if it was just the one lousy point at the end.
So I know you guys have questions out there. I've asked a couple of silly ones. I don't have any additional microphones, so if you guys can come up, I'll share mine, and you can ask your questions. I apologize.
Or we can...
So question for all 3 panelists. In the games that you've worked on, are there any bugs that still drive you crazy?
Any what?
Are there any bugs in the games you've worked on that still drive you crazy?
Well, there was one in Pong. There were a bunch of bugs, but I think the most fatal one was we had a route, and we used to have pinball machines and video games out there in the Santa Clara area, and we'd use that for lunch money. And we went to a pizza parlor, Nolan and Ted Dabney and I, and we would collect the money from the machine, split the 50-50 with the operator, then buy lunch with all the quarters. And I go up there to play the Pong that we had sitting there, and it was very cold, it was winter, and I threw a little spark on the machine, and boom, I got a free play. And that ruined my lunch, I can tell you that. And it took me about 3 weeks of pulling hair out, I used to have hair, that to figure out what to do with that. So that was a very fatal bug. I mean, there was no program, so it wasn't really bugs in that sense, but it was a hardware failure. And the other funny one was we were making these things in our first factory on Martin Street, an old roller skating rink. And we hired people from the unemployment office, and oh my God, we had color. People were moving parts on skateboards through the floor. It was all old roller skating rinks, had a hardwood floor. And we had games for the workers to play. And one of the guys said, oh, did you know this? If you hit the coin mech was on the front, and if you hit the lower right carriage bolt with the cue ball, you get a free play. I go, no, and he demonstrated it for me. Oh, okay. So that was another bug that I had to fix.
Yeah. I'm always obsessed by the idea that maybe if somebody was a little cleverer about the interior of Space War, there would be time to get the torpedoes affected by gravity.
Mm-hmm.
Did anybody ever rewrite the code or modify the code?
Oh yes.
So there was source code was out there, right?
Well, yeah, and most people just looked at it and said, oh, I think I could do that.
Okay.
And they had either a different computer or a different display or, something was different, so they had to do their own. One guy had worked in a den of experimental physicists, and they had PDP-1 no, it wasn't PDP-1, it was something else. But anyway, they had a display and a system for reading bubble chamber pictures.
Okay.
So that was serious work. But it turned out that you could make a space war for it. And what happened was they had a handful of buggy space wars that sort of worked on their hardware. And this guy didn't write any of them. He just merged them and got them to work well enough so that you could actually play through a game.
Something to avoid work. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'd say by the time I was done with Adventure, I had it pretty clean, but there were certainly some bugs along the way that were entertaining. One that comes to mind was, in Crowther's version, it was fairly small. The dwarves would show up at certain points, and then they would follow a fixed path around the dungeon until they ran into you, and then they'd follow you around. When I made the dungeon 3 times larger, I needed to have some way to have them walk more randomly, so I added a random walk without backtracking, except when they hit a dead end, and that got them to explore the cave a lot more. And then I added the second maze, the all different maze, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially 11 or 12 rooms, each of which is connected to all of the others, because it uses all of the 8 compass points plus up and down. So yeah, I guess it's 11 rooms connected to each to the other 10. And I found that the next time I played the game, I was wandering around the dungeon or the cave, and I wasn't seeing any dwarves until I happened to wander into the all different maze, and I found them all, because if a dwarf got into that maze, it was never getting out again, because the random walk just never happened to hit the 1 or 2 places you could get out of the maze from. And I said, well, that won't do. And so I had to add some special rules to mark places as, the dwarves won't go here unless they're following the player, because they just get trapped.
Regarding the final point in Adventure, did you expect anybody to ever find that without decompiling the program?
A fair question. I'm trying to remember, at least one version of Adventure I did throw in a small hint that there was a note in the magazine saying, please do not remove these from this construction area. But beyond that, no, it was pretty much just in there as a final dick move, I have to admit. Some people had similar trouble with the end game. Version 2, I finally added a little bit clearer clue as to how to get out of the end game as well, although people did figure that one out on their own.
Maybe if I can ask a little off-topic question, mostly for Steve. Can you talk a little bit about implementing Lisp?
Yeah. But my official job when I escaped from college was working on the MIT AI project. And this was in the fall of 1958. And John McCarthy was just kind of figuring out how to do Lisp. And I started out hand compiling some of the early Lisp functions. And when John finally figured out how to do the interpreter, which was a few months later, I looked at it and said, oh, I know how to do that. And so I sat down and hand compiled the code for probably took me 6 weeks or so, and got it more or less working. And then Jim Slagle, who is a blind graduate student and very smart, started explaining how he was going to do formal integration, symbolic integration with Lisp. And he had a tricky double recursion, and I was sitting in the back of the room with some of the other people who had worked on the interpreter and the compiler, and we realized the function he had written down should work the way he expected it, but it didn't stand a chance of working with the original implementation. So we, I don't know who figured it out, but the group of us convinced ourselves that the function funarg hack, which was what we called it, would fix the problem. This was a way of getting a previous version of the stack to what was visible inside a functional argument. And so I spent another month or so recoding Lisp to use that. And it worked, and Jim did his thesis on symbolic integration. And much, much later, John expressed some doubts about that. He felt that maybe I had rushed into this too early. But I think he wished he had thought about it a little more and figured out some more neat features that later on showed up. Because it turns out we didn't provide anywhere near all the facilities that you could do by storing previous versions of the stack. And so Lisp might have looked a lot like Pascal sooner, but it didn't. Or Python, sorry, sooner, but it didn't. And unfortunately, we also had a very early tradition, which stuck for almost forever, of not documenting the code in the code. Because the first version, if you put in a comment, it actually used free storage space. And unfortunately, long after that problem was fixed, that tradition stayed on with the writers of Lisp programs.
Ouch. How bad habits get formed.
Yeah, well, the libraries and the traditions that surround programming languages are at least as important as the language itself. And you get all sorts of different styles depending on the language. and the state of the library.
All right, there's got to be more. Who else has questions? Really?
This is for Al. So the name Atari to me is just absolutely amazing. I mean, it's part of my childhood, and it's really sad that today it's Xbox and PlayStation and Nintendo. You being the capitalist, if you could spin back time and change something to make Atari that name today, what do you think would be different? Was it the sell to Time Warner? Was it the 5200? What do you think, you could have changed to have made it the name that's out there today
So like,
in gaming?
what could we have done that would have kept Atari, as we know it, alive still today? He goes, yeah, well, gosh, wow, I really have thought of that one before. On one hand, I don't think it would last because the way Nolan and the gang did things, it was just, the reason, okay, we had to sell to Warner. We had no equity in the company. We'd gotten into consumer business, which is a business that can be very profitable, but you sell everything in the last 3 months of the year, and you build them in the first 6 months of the year, so you have to guess how many you're going to make, and you either guess too many or too little. Believe me, guessing too many is much worse than guessing too little, and you can make a lot of money, but you can also lose it all the next year. So it was a very difficult thing, and so we needed equity. We tried to go public. We actually there was a red herring. I've donated it to Stanford. They actually have a red herring that we almost went public, but the market tanked. So we finally found a suitor that could give us the equity. We were in with Sequoia Capital, Don Valentine. They gave us enough money to get going, but the consumer stuff was nutso. So that got us there, and it was a typical acquisition. It was wonderful. Everything was sweet and honeymoon and all that. But after a couple of years, they couldn't stand Nolan, because we would solve problems by engineering new products, and they would solve problems by throwing ad money at it. And they were right. We were going to kill the VCS in 1979 and replace it with a new product. That's the way we did things. We were stunned that it lasted as long as it did. And Warner said no, and they put a lot of ad money behind it, which we did not like, because there was a bonus pool people don't know about for the key executives. I was one of them, and it was pretty substantial, and if they spent that money on advertising, it would not trigger, the bonus wouldn't trigger that year. So we didn't really like that, but in retrospect, it was the right decision, and it became a billion-dollar company. I don't know if I'd want it to be alive. I think all this new blood and the new stuff that came in has made it a vibrant industry. And in fact, I don't think that anybody's really dominant is really good. I think that's great. So, que sera, we had a lot of fun. Apple, I would argue, spun out of Atari, and that was a nutso kind of a time.
So speaking of the VCS, so you were sort of around during that time. Do you have any fun stories or anything about sort of the birth of the VCS?
Yeah, the VCS, sure, that was a radical product. One hand, the architecture and the design was revolutionary. We were not the first cartridge system. I would think the Fairchild Channel F with Jerry Lawson was probably the first. We knew the concept was pretty clear and obvious. We were making new custom chips for every game. That wasn't going to work. But the traditional way of doing it, I got a little technical here, was to have a memory map. So that was the obvious way. So you had RAM memory that represented every spot on the screen, and the computer would write into that, right? And then the hardware would display that RAM memory. Well, that's a lot of parts. And the semiconductor companies love selling semiconductors, and that was what these systems were. And they would have sprites and stuff like that. And Steve Mayer, genius, up at Grass Valley, Steve Rayer and Ron Milner in 3 months designed the architecture for the VCS, which basically used a 6502 microprocessor that was fast enough, and we had a chip called the Stella chip that did 2 lines of video, 2 scan lines of video at a time. So the code had to keep up with the beam. And vertical sync was in software. That's why when you pull the cartridge out of a VCS, you just see vertical bars, because there's no vertical sync anymore. And so so all of a sudden, a system that would do crude early video games with a cartridge ROM that had like 14 chips in it, some of them substantially expensive, we reduced it to 3 chips. And that was a lot cheaper, and like they couldn't believe it. So there was 128 bytes of RAM in the entire VCS. And the program size was limited at first to 2K of ROM. And that's what it did. So programming it was not easy. You had to count clock cycles. So that was a challenge. The other aspect, I think, an interesting story about the VCS and why it was as dramatic an introduction, that aforementioned Magnavox lawsuit that we settled with Magnavox for, I think, $300,000 or $400,000 paid up license, also had a provision that said every new consumer game that we introduced for 365 days after the signing of that agreement, which was 1 week before the CES show, Magnavox had the right to sell and build and produce and compete with us. Okay, so that was the first time it caused Nolan and Joe and the guys to keep their mouths shut for a whole year. And the only secret, we used to say at Atari, the only secret we had was we don't have any secrets. But this one we kept secret, so that the next year at the CES show, we made a big introduction, and it was really a lot of fun to be there. It was the hit of the show, and I'm really glad we were able to ship all the engineers out to Chicago to see that introduction. It was a great feeling. And in fact, it had scared Don, we had just hired away the entire consumer product division from National Semiconductor. And they were trying to compete with us, and Rick Simone, I think, was there, and he was working for us now in the chip design stuff, and he's walking by the Fairchild booth, or the national booth, and one of the sales guys grabs him and says, "Hey, you got to get that prototype of the cartridge. Atari's killing us." And he says, "Excuse me, but I'm working for Atari now." And that was great. That felt good. So, that ended their foray into games.
Yep. Come on up.
Hi, I have a question.
That was me.
Hi, I have a question for Steve Russell. Just curious what kind of person, what kind of John McCarthy was, and what it was like to work for him.
Work for who?
McCarthy.
Oh, well, he was the best boss I ever had. Les Ernest was a very close second. Les Ernest was brought on the Stanford AI group to keep McCarthy more or less under control. It was sometimes hard to get a decision out of him. He had a wonderful habit of disappearing. You'd be talking to him and you'd glance away and poof, he'd be gone. And one of the things that we learned was that his lecturing was not perhaps as clear as it could have been with a little preparation. Because he would frequently, 5 minutes before he had a class, say, "Oh, I have a class in 5 minutes. I have to think about what I'm going to say." And at MIT, he was teaching Introduction to Artificial Intelligence to a bunch of grad students, and they began to call it Uncle John's Mystery Hour. It turned out that he told you exactly what you needed to know, and a lot of things you didn't need to know, in exactly the same tone of voice. And so if you knew what you were supposed to learn out of this, it was no problem. You got the information you needed. But if you didn't know exactly what was going on, you got this flood of information and you had no way of sorting it out. But he was very smart and very interesting to talk to, and he handled people very well. And Les was equally good at handling people, a little more firm, and also very interesting to talk to.
Still is.
Yes.
Is there anyone else with questions? There we go.
How many versions of Adventure did you create, and do you still talk to Will Crowther?
Let's see. Yeah, there were probably 3 different versions that I directly created. There's version 1, which is the one that I mostly disseminated as people asked for copies during the first year. And about a year after that, I made a few small changes and called it version 1.5. And then eventually came out with a 2.0, which added like I think 5 treasures on top of the 15 that were in the original, my original game. And a third maze. I turned the forest outside into yet another type of maze and various other things that got added to it. There are, of course, many more versions than that out there because, as I say, I did give the source away for free, and many people came up with their own modifications.
There were sort of progressive releases because it seemed like early on when I was playing it, every week there'd be a new room or 2.
That reminds me more of how Zork came out than Adventure. When Adventure came out, well, I mean, I was developing it at Stanford for a while, but by the time I actually began distributing it around the net, I think it had most of the original 15 treasures. There were certainly some things that got added to it over time because when I first made it available and then went on vacation for a week, I had set up a special account. People could log in over the ARPANET to this account, and it would specifically just fire up the game and let them play it. And Les Ernest, among others, complained at me about the load this was putting on the machine because people were logging in from all over the country in order to play Adventure. And so I had to add some stuff to the game to make it not allow people to play if the load average was too high or at certain times of day. But I still consider that all sort of the first version with some rough edges that got touched up. But there are other versions. As I said, that one was the 350-point version. I came up with the 430-point version too. But I know there's like a 550-point one that came out somewhere. And many of the things I've seen in those other extended versions are things that could easily have gone into the original. Some of them I think are not really in the same tone. The puzzles seem more technological or more intricate, things I'd expect to find in Zork and some of the other later games. I mean, I saw one version where you had 5 colored buttons that you had to figure out what order to push them in. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it just didn't seem to fit the theme of the existing game. But there was one version, for example, from Software Toolworks, run by Scott Adams, the other Scott Adams. And they asked for Crowther and me to endorse it. And they wanted us to endorse it as the original Adventure. And so we played through it because I wasn't going to endorse it unless I'd actually tried it. And I found that, yes, it had everything from the original Adventure. They'd added 2 or 3 treasures to it with their own puzzles. And those I thought were reasonably in keeping. They had something that happened in the middle of the troll bridge. If you stopped there, there was something you could do. And another place where you could extend from what we had already done. And so we ended up endorsing it not as, quote, the original Adventure, but as having as having everything from the original Adventure, and that we thought everything in it was in the spirit of the original game. That was the endorsement we were willing to give. As far as being in contact with Crowther, yes, I have his email. I still send him comments every now and again, usually when somebody contacts me asking if I know how to get in touch with them. Usually what happens is I'll pass along their message and usually no, he's not interested in getting in touch. He's actually not that much into gaming. He did the original game more as a way to have a way to spend time with his kids after his divorce. He and his wife had in fact done the original exploration of Colossal Cave, and that's part of where it came from. But he's turned down opportunities to show up for the first Penguin Award that I got at the Game Developers Conference some years ago. Was shared with him, but he didn't want to come out for it and so forth. So he tends to be pretty secluded, but yes, I'm still in touch with him.
Anyone else?
I won't knock it away. So given that all of you were sort of at the birth of this industry now and we're a part of it, is there any history that you feel like we're losing or any stories that no one's ever told in magazines or anything that we should be working toward preserving right now?
In my opinion, it's the opposite. The stories are getting better and better and more more interesting as time goes by. I wish they'd slow it down a little bit because I read some of this, go, holy shit, I didn't know that was going on. So I think it's well covered, perhaps too well covered. That's my view.
Well, I'm always looking forward to the next story.
Yeah.
And I must confess that sometimes I enjoy the disasters more than the successes.
Yeah. They certainly taught us more.
Yes, we learn from making mistakes, just not only from making mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. At this point, I feel like people have asked the same questions often enough, and every once in a while, new questions come up, and every once in a while, the answers change too, which is fascinating. For the longest time, I gave the original date of adventure as 1976, and it turned out we eventually got hold of some archive tapes from the Stanford AI Lab, and I found, oh, that was 1977. My bad. But at this point, I think we've got, the history is pretty well nailed down, and there's a lot of places that have it published for posterity. So I'm sure there will be bits we lose, but a lot of it's out there, and that's good.
Oh, there you go.
So at one of the early vintage computer fairs, I saw one of the exhibitors had one of my games, and I sat down to play it, and I couldn't remember how to play it. So I wanted to ask you, Don, if you had to play Adventure right now, how many points would you get? How well would you do at Space War? And could kids wipe your ass with Pong right now out?
I definitely want to point out that Steve is the single most vicious Space War player I have ever seen.
Cool.
Actually, Alex down at the front desk consistently beats me at Space War.
Right. As far as adventure, at this point, I would certainly fumble my way a little bit through the mazes and some things like that. I'm pretty sure I remember all the steps. I might not get them done efficiently enough, particularly if we're talking version 2, because version 1, I added a way to try to force players to be efficient by having the batteries in the lamp run out, and if that happened, you had to spend one of the treasures, the coins, to get fresh batteries, and so you couldn't get top score anymore. And instead, this made people play slower, because the way to get around that is you turn off the lamp at every opportunity and do things in the dark and then turn it on and move, and that's even more steps, and so that was just wrong. And so version 2, I just did it the brute force way. I said, after so many turns, you get a message saying you're taking too long, and it docks you a couple of points. And then after a few more 100 turns, it'll say, a seasoned adventurer should be done by now, and it docks you another few points, and so on. And so in version 2, to get the top score, you have to get everything done in 350 moves or less. And I probably wouldn't be able to do that anymore. It requires knowing a lot about the internals of the game or figuring out some or just getting lucky. Things like what causes the end game to trigger. There's a way to make it happen faster. You know, it starts when you find the last treasure and a timer starts. But you want to say, okay, so I want to find the last treasure when I have just enough time to get all this last batch of treasures out of the cave and then get back in just as the cave starts to close so I can get into the end game faster. And then there's things you can do even then to get it to trigger the end game a little bit sooner. But there's all sorts of places where you just have to know the efficient ways around the cave. And I know some of them, but I wouldn't get them all right anymore. I would probably have trouble getting the top score just because I'd lose on time.
I often am asked to play Pong with some young people that created their version in JavaScript or whatever, and Pong is still the simplest game that was ever conceived of for video games, so it's great for people practicing, learning how to do this stuff. And so I get my ass beat all the time on playing Pong. Very rarely the original Pong. I'm pretty good with the original, but those are very few and far between. But when a kid makes his own version, he can usually beat me on that. So, but it's great. I mean, I'm just delighted that it's used as a vehicle to hopefully train a whole new generation of nerds.
All right, I think we're settling down on questions. So I've got a couple of quick plugs. First, you guys get some free t-shirts.
I got mine, yeah.
But everyone else wants to buy them, and they're great. And like I said, they even immortalize Get Lamp, which is from the original adventure. The other thing I wanted to plug is that we've got our consignment booth still running, but we're going to be shutting that down relatively soon. So if you're interested in buying some more stuff for your pile, do it now. Other than that, gentlemen, thank you very much for a wonderful panel. That was awesome. And thank the audience as well.